Our discussion for today will be about the urinary system. The urinary system is the major excretory system of the body. Apparently, some organs in our system also eliminate waste, but they are not able to compensate in the case of any kidney failure. So apart from the excretory functions of the urinary system, it is also responsible for the blood volume and blood pressure control. It is also responsible for the pH regulation of the body. It is also responsible for the concentration of solutes. It is also needed for the vitamin D production and of course the red blood cell concentration. The major components of the urinary system includes your kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and your urethra. All of these parts will be then discussed as we go along this lecture. In this image, it actually shows you the anterior view of the urinary system. The kidneys are basically located in the abdominal cavity, with the right kidney just below your liver and the left kidney below the spleen. The ureters extend from the kidneys to the urinary bladder with the pelvic cavity. And in your pelvic cavity, it would actually show you where your urinary bladder lies. An adrenal gland is also found or located at the superior pole of the kidneys. So those are just the major parts of your urinary system. The kidneys are considered bilateral retroperitoneal organs which are bean-shaped and they weigh around 5 ounces, which is equivalent to a bar of soap or the size of your fist. It is also basically located between your 12th thoracic and 3rd lumbar vertebrae. For its structures, it has a renal capsule, which is actually a connective tissue that surrounds each kidney, and it actually functions for the protection and acts as a barrier for your kidneys. It also has a hilum, which is an indentation, and it contains your renal artery, the veins, the nerves, and your ureter. Other structures also include your renal sinus, which contains your renal pelvis, the blood vessels, and the fats found in your kidneys. You also have the renal cortex, which is the outer portion of your kidney, and your renal medulla, which is the inner portion. Your kidneys do also have what you call your renal pyramids. So this is the junction between your cortex and your medulla. You also have the calyx, which are the tip of your pyramids, and your renal pelvis, where calyces join, and it actually narrows down to form your ureters. This image actually shows you the longitudinal section of the kidneys. So the image here on your left screen is actually an image representation of how a kidney looks like when it's being drawn. And you also have here an image on your right, which is actually through a section of a human kidney. So this is actually how you compare a drawing of your kidney and how it looks like when you observe such parts in the section of a human kidney. So the cortex and the middle of the kidney actually surround your renal sinus. So here you see your renal sinus here. And you have here your cortex and then your medulla. So this is apparently the renal capsule that surrounds the totality of your kidneys. So the renal sinuses is actually a space containing your renal pelvis, the calyces, blood vessels, adipose tissues, and other connective tissues. And then you also have here your renal pyramids, okay, which extends from the cortex of the kidney to the renal sinus. And then the tip of each renal pyramid is surrounded by a what you call calyx. So this is the calyx part. And the calyces are actually the ones that connect to your renal pelvis. So this is the pathway of your renal pelvis. After your renal pelvis, it would actually show you how the urine flows from the tip of the renal pyramid through the calyx and the renal pelvis into your ureter. Next, we have your nephron. So this is actually the functional unit of your kidneys, and there are about over 1 million nephrons per kidney. There are two types of nephrons in the kidney. First one would be your juxtamedullary, and then the other one is your cortical. So there are approximately 15% which are juxtamedullary, and the nephron includes the renal corpuscle, proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, and your collecting duct. The components of the nephron includes your renal corpuscle. So this structure contains your Bowman's capsule and a glomerulus. So the Bowman's capsule is an enlarged end of the nephron. It opens into your proximal tubule and it contains what you call podocytes, which are specialized cells around the glomerular capillaries. So you also have again your glomerulus, which contains your capillaries that are wrapped around it. In this image, it actually shows you the renal corpuscle and filtration membrane. So to further understand, let's take a look at them closely. So in this image, in letter A, it would actually show you how a renal corpuscle look like. So it actually consists of a Bowman capsule and the glomerulus. So that's what you call your renal corpuscle. So the Bowman's capsule is the enlarged end of a nephron, which is indented to form a double-walled chamber. Bowman's capsule surrounds the glomerulus, which is a network of capillaries, and the blood flows from the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus and leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. So that's the pathway of the blood in your renal corpuscles. So having a bigger picture of your renal corpuscle, okay, here you would see that the Bowman's capsule do have an outer and inner layer. So the outer layer are basically formed of different cells or flat cells, and then the inner layer is made up of your podocytes. So in the inner layer of your Bowman's capsule that covers the glomerular capillaries, fluid from the blood enters the Bowman capsule by passing through the capillary walls and visceral layer of your Bowman's capsule. From there, the fluid passes into the proximal convoluted tubule, so this part, and then the juxtaglomerular apparatus consists of the cells from the wall of the afferent arteriole and the distal convoluted tubule. So this one, on the other end, is the distal convoluted tubule. So zooming in into your podocytes, okay, so in the glomerulus, it is composed of capillaries with pores. So here you have smaller pores, okay, inside of it. So in the layer of the Bowman's capsule, it consists of specialized cells, what you call your podocytes. And the spaces between the podocyte cell processes allow fluid to pass into the Bowman's capsule. So in here, you will see how the filtration membrane looks like. So the filtration membrane actually consists of your glomerular capillary endothelium in this one, this layer, and then a basement membrane above it, and then of course the podocyte cell processes. So the fluid passes from the capillary through the filtration membrane into your Bowman's capsule. So for the components of the nephron, again, we have the filtration membrane, which is in the renal corpuscle. It includes glomerular capillaries, the podocytes, and of course your basement membrane. When you say filtrate, it is actually the liquid that passes across the filtration membrane, and then you have the proximal tubule where filtrate passes first. And then you also have the loop of Henle. It contains the descending and ascending loops. This is where water and solutes pass through thin walls by diffusion. And then you have the distal tubule. This is the structure between the loop of Henle and the collecting duct. And of course, the collecting duct, which empties into calyces, and they carry fluid from the cortex through your medulla. So in here, it shows you the nephron, which is the functional unit of your kidney. So a nephron consists of renal corpuscle, this one, this side. And then it also has a proximal convoluted tubule, a loop of Henle. So as you see, the loop of Henle do have different segments as well. So it has the thin segment of the descending limb, and then you have the thin segment of the ascending limb, and then the thick segment of the ascending limb. So the distal convoluted tubules actually empties into a collecting duct, and then the juxtaglomerulary or juxtamedullary nephrons. This is actually an example of the juxtamedullary nephron, which are actually those near the medulla. So this part is the medulla of your kidney. And they have loops of Henle that extend deep into the medulla of the kidney, whereas the cortical nephrons do not. So an example would be this one. The loop of Henle is not really embedded through the renal medulla. So collecting ducts merge into larger papillary ducts which empty into a calyx. So once the urine or the filtrate has already traveled from urinal corpuscle, proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal tubule, of course, all of it will be going down into the collecting ducts and then to the calyx and eventually to your ureter. So the flow of filtrate through the nephron, first, it will be coming from your renal corpuscle, going to your proximal tubule, going down to the descending loop of Henle, and then ascending loop of Henle, the distal tubule, collecting duct, the calyx, the renal pelvis, and then going out to your ureter. So the blood flow through the kidneys. So apparently a while ago, what I'm discussing is about the flow of the filtrates. Here, we will now be studying the blood flow in your kidneys. So this image actually shows you the blood flow through the kidneys with the representation and numbering. Okay. So first, the blood flow will be coming from your renal artery, and then going to your interlobar artery, and then next is to your arcuate artery, going to your interlobular arteries, and then going looking at it closely, it will enter your afferent arteriole, okay, here. So interlobular, going to your afferent arteriole, and then going to your glomerulus, exiting your efferent arteriole, and then going to your peritubular capillaries, and then going to your vasa recta. After the vasa recta, it would go back to your arcuate vein, interlobular vein, and then the arcuate vein, the interlobular veins, the interlobar veins, and then eventually your renal vein. So that's the complete blood flow through your kidneys. So for the urine formation, it actually involves three processes. First one would be your filtration, which occurs in the renal corpuscle. And then you have the reabsorption, where it involves removing substances from the filtrate and placing back into the blood. And then we have the secretion. It actually involves the taking substances from the blood at a nephron area other than the renal corpuscle and putting it back into the nephron tubules. So in this one, it would actually show you the urine formation. So for the filtration part, it's actually represented by this blue arrow. So in this movement of materials across in the filtration membrane into the Bowman's capsule to form a filtrate. Okay. So in the tubular reabsorption, solutes are reabsorbed. This is represented by the purple arrow. So from coming here, it will be reabsorbed across the wall of the nephron into the interstitial fluid by transport processes such as active transport and co-transport. So water is reabsorbed by the representation of this green arrow, and it is across the wall of the nephrons by osmosis. And then water and solutes pass from the interstitial fluid into the peritubular capillaries. So this is the peritubular capillaries. And then for the tubular secretion, this is actually represented by the orange arrow. The solutes are secreted again back across the wall of the nephron into the filtrate. So the urine formation-filtration process is actually the movement of water, ions, small molecules through filtration membrane into the Bowman's capsule. 90% of plasma becomes filtrate. 180 liters of filtrate are produced by the nephrons each day, and 1% of the filtrate, or about 1.8 liters, become urine, and the rest is reabsorbed. Only small molecules are able to pass through the filtration membrane, and the formation of filtrate depends on the filtration pressure. The filtration pressure forces fluid across filtration membrane, and filtration pressure is influenced by blood pressure. In the filtration pressure, this is actually how it looks like. So the filtration pressure across the filtration membrane is equal to the glomerular capillary pressure minus the capsular pressure and minus the colloid osmotic pressure. So this is how it's being computed. So as you see the glomerular capillary pressure here, and then this is the capsular and the colloid pressure. So that's how your filtration pressure is computed. So for the urine production and reabsorption, 99% of the filtrate is reabsorbed and re-enters the circulation. Proximal tubule is primary site for reabsorption of the solutes and water. On the other hand, the descending loop of Henle concentrates the filtrates, and reabsorption of water and solutes from distal tubule and collecting duct is controlled by your hormones. In this image, it shows you the reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule. So solutes molecules such as amino acids, glucose and fructose, as well as sodium, potassium, calcium, bicarbonate, and chloride are reabsorbed by the active transport and co-transport out of the proximal convoluted tubule by the epithelial cells. So basically, the different transport processes are shown here with different colors of arrows. So for active transport and co-transport, so more likely those are being used for solutes. So it's the red and the green arrows. Well, for water, specifically for the transfer of water, okay, from the from the proximal tubule to your peritubular capillaries, it's through osmosis. So solutes plus 65% of the filtrate volume are reabsorbed from the proximal convoluted tubule and enter the peritubular capillaries. And then water moves by osmosis out of the proximal convoluted tubule. So as you see here, you have your proximal convoluted tubule. In between them is the interstitial fluid, and then the site wherein reabsorption occurs would be your peritubular capillaries. So apart from having the different transport processes, of course, there's always the influence of blood flow. For the urine concentration, the descending limb of the loop of Henle is a critical site for water reabsorption. The filtrate leaving the proximal convoluted tubule is further concentrated as it passes through the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The mechanism for this water reabsorption is again what you call your osmosis. The renal medulla contains very concentrated interstitial fluid that has large amounts of sodium and chloride and urea. The water of the thin segment of the descending limb is highly permeable to water. As the filtrate moves through the medulla containing the highly concentrated interstitial fluid, water is reabsorbed out of the nephron by osmosis, and then the water enters the vasa recta. The ascending limb of the loop of Henle dilutes the filtrate by removing solutes, and then the thin segment of the ascending limb is not permeable to water, but it is permeable to your solutes. Consequently, solutes diffuse out of your nephrons. In this one, this image shows you the urine concentrating mechanism. So it has different levels, may it be from the part of the cortex of the kidney, maybe the segment of the outer medulla, or the inner medulla. So the concentration of the interstitial fluid is usually measured with milliosmoles per liter. So the concentration gradient from the cortex to the inner medulla is shown here on the left. And then you see here that the interstitial fluid increases in the concentration from 300 milliosmoles in the cortex to 1,200 milliosmoles in the medulla. The concentration of the filtrate in the different parts of the nephron are also shown here. So as you see, the release, of course, of or the concentration of the solutes, like your sodium chloride or your salts, and then you also have here water reuptake. Okay? So approximately 180 liters of filtrate enters the nephrons each day, and of that volume, only 65% is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. So in here, water is reabsorbed. In the proximal convoluted tubule, solute molecules move by active transport and co-transport from the lumen of the tubule into the interstitial fluid. And water moves by osmosis because of the cells of the tubule wall are permeable to water. So approximately 15% of the filtrate volume is reabsorbed in the segment of the descending limb. And the descending limb passes through the concentrated interstitial fluid of the medulla. Because the wall of the descending limb is permeable to water, water moves by osmosis from the tubule into the more concentrated interstitial fluid. By the time that the filtrate reaches the tip of the renal pyramid, the concentration of the filtrate is equal now to the concentration of the interstitial fluid. The ascending limb of the loop of Henle is not permeable to water, so solutes diffuse out of the thin segment. Sodium then are actively transported, and potassium and chloride are co-transported from the filtrate of the thick segment into the interstitial fluid. So the volume of the filtrate doesn't change as it passes through the ascending limb, but the concentration is greatly reduced. By the time that the filtrate reaches the cortex of the kidney, the concentration is approximately 100 milliosmoles per liter, which is less concentrated than the interstitial fluid of the cortex, which is about 300 milliosmol per liter. So the distal convoluted tubule, on the other hand, and the collecting ducts are permeable to water, and if ADH is present, water moves by osmosis from the less concentrated filtrate into the more concentrated interstitial fluid. By the time that the filtrate reaches up the tip of the renal pyramid, an additional 19% of the filtrate is reabsorbed. And then 1% or less remains as urine when ADH is present. Here, this is the reabsorption in the loop of Henle. So as you see here, we have the ascending vasa recta. You also have the interstitial fluid, and of course the descending limb of loop of Henle. So in here, you will see different arrows pertaining to the flow of the blood. Orange arrows for osmosis, black arrows for solute diffusion. And then in here, the wall of the thin segment of the descending loop of Henle is permeable to water and to a lesser extent to solutes. The interstitial fluid in the medulla of the kidney and the blood in the vasa recta have high solute concentration. Water therefore moves by osmosis from the tubule into the interstitial fluid and into the vasa recta. So here, from the descending loop to the vasa recta. An additional 15% of the filtrate volume is reabsorbed, and to a lesser extent, solutes diffuse from the vasa recta and interstitial fluid into the tubule. So on the other hand, in the thin segment of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle is not permeable to water, but is permeable to solutes. In this site, the solutes diffuse out the tubule and into the more dilute interstitial fluid as the ascending limb projects towards the cortex. And then the solutes diffuse into the descending vasa recta. So as you see here, there's really a big difference when it comes to the to the way that the water is coming in and out from based on which segment of the loop of Henle they are coming from. So when a segment of the loop of Henle is permeable to water, that's where osmosis happens. So basically, it's in the descending limb of the loop of Henle. But when it comes to the thin segment of the ascending limb, since it is not permeable to water, water can't come out to it. So it's just the solutes that can be transported into the vasa recta. So here is the reabsorption in the thick segment of the ascending limb. So in here, as you see, you have the red arrows representing the active transport and the green arrow for co-transport. Again, for the co-transport system, it's usually potassium and chloride ions that are being co-transported. And then active transport are for the use of your sodium ions. So the thick segment of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle is not permeable to water. So as you see, there's no flow of water from the thick segment going to our vasa recta. And that's actually how the transportation of those or the absorption of the filtrate is happening in the thick segment of the ascending limb. And then next, you have the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct reabsorption. So in here, you will see that there are three processes. You have active transport, co-transport, and osmosis. So when osmosis is present, so basically this distal convoluted tubule or the collecting duct is actually permeable to water. So the water moves by osmosis from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. And then the sodium moves by active transport and chloride moves by co-transport. So that's going out from the distal convoluted tubule to the collecting duct. And then the reabsorbed water and solutes enter the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. So for the urine production and secretion, the tubular secretion removes some substances from the blood. And these substances include byproducts of metabolism that become toxic in high concentrations and drugs or other molecules not normally produced by the body. Tubular secretion occurs through either active or passive mechanisms. So in here, ammonia secretion is passive, and then the secretion of hydrogen, potassium, creatinine, histamine, and penicillin is by active transport. These substances are actively transported into the nephron, and the secretion of hydrogen plays an important role in regulating the body fluid pH. So remember that the reason why your urine is smelly or yung maamoy sila, it's because of the presence of ammonia. For the urine concentration and volume regulation, there are three major hormonal mechanisms that are involved in regulating the urine concentration and volume. First one would be the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone Mechanism. Second is with the presence of the antidiuretic hormone or the ADH. And the last one would be the atrial natriuretic hormone. So for the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, we all know that renin acts on angiotensinogen to produce angiotensin 1. Angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and then angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. Angiotensin 2 acts on adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and aldosterone increases the rate of active transport of sodium in distal tubules and your collecting ducts, making the volume of water in your urine decreasing. So in here, this is the aldosterone action, aldosterone and the regulation of sodium and water in your extracellular fluid. So when there's a presence of low blood pressure, it stimulates the renin secretion from the kidney. So once the kidney produces this renin stimulates the production of angiotensin 1, which is converted to angiotensin 2, which in turn stimulates the aldosterone secretion from your adrenal cortex. So with the aldosterone increasing sodium and water absorption in the kidney, of course, it will actually result in increase in blood pressure. With the antidiuretic hormone mechanism, increase of blood solute concentration affects hypothalamic neurons and decreased blood pressure affects your baroreceptors. As a result of this stimuli, the posterior pituitary secretes your ADH, which increases water reabsorption by the kidneys. So once water reabsorption is increased, of course, it would result to a decreased volume of your urine. So ADH is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, and it acts on the kidneys, causing them to absorb more water. In return again, it's because it would result to decrease urine volume. So its result is to maintain a normal blood volume and blood pressure. For the atrial natriuretic hormone, so increased BP in the right atrium of the heart causes increased secretion of the NAH or the atrial natriuretic hormone, which increases sodium excretion and water loss in the form of urine. So if there's an increase in NaH secretion, of course, the kidney would actually have increased sodium excretion and increased water loss, resulting in decreased blood pressure. Here, this is actually an image showing you the homeostatic control of the blood and urine volumes. So again, talking about homeostasis, of course, when um, homeostasis is disturbed, okay, in the higher end of your homeostatic balance, what would happen is that, of course, there would be results of different stimulus, which includes your receptor and control centers like your pituitary gland. So in here, your baroreceptors inhibit posterior pituitary ADH secretion when blood volume increases. In your kidney, juxtaglomerular apparati inhibit renin release when blood volume increases, which decreases your aldosterone secretion. The heart, the atrial cardiac muscles secrete ANH when blood volume increases, and the blood vessels um, do have sympathetic division baroreceptors detecting increased blood volume, which causes vasodilation of the renal arteries. With this stimulus, of course, there will always be a response, and the effectors would be having the reaction of decreased ADH, decreases water reabsorption by the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts. Less water returns to the blood and more water is lost in the urine, which decreases blood volume. It is also affecting, of course, the decreased aldosterone and increased ANH, decreased sodium reabsorption from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So more sodium and water are lost in the urine, which decreases your blood volume. And increased renal blood flow increases the rate of filtrate formation and more water is lost in the urine. So once the homeostasis is restored, reduced blood volume due to loss of water and sodium in the urine lowers blood pressure as well. So it would go back definitely to homeostasis. Okay. So in here, as you see, it's usually high blood volume, which induces elevated blood pressure. Okay, so basically, with the homeostatic control of your blood and urine, more likely what's being, or the factor that's being considered is always the elevation of your blood pressure. So on the other hand, if low blood volume induces lowered blood pressure, of course, there would also be other stimulus. Again, it includes your blood vessels, the heart, the kidneys, and the pituitary. And of course, it would also have a response with your effectors, and you will know that your homeostasis is restored with increased blood volume due to decreased sodium and water loss in the urine, which raises your blood pressure. So for the other parts of your urinary system, again, you have your ureters, urinary bladder, and your urethra. So the ureters are small tubes that carry urine from the renal pelvis of the kidney to the bladder. And then the bladder is found in your pelvic cavity. It is responsible for storing your urine, and it can only hold a few milliliters to a maximum of 1,000 milliliters. So basically, kapag ka in the process of you need to urinate, hindi naman talaga nare-reach ng ating urinary bladder yung full potential niya or yung capacity niya bago pa kayo umihi. So, what I actually learned before is that even around 25% only of the amount of urine being stored in your urinary bladder would actually um, make you respond to go to urinate. Okay? So, kapag sinasabi mo daw sa teacher mo na, Ma'am, I'm 25% or maybe, Ma'am, I'm 50%, it just means that you really would like to urinate. Okay? So, imagine if you can, if you will still wait for the 1,000 milliliters maximum capacity of your urinary bladder, para kang umiihi ng 1 litrong Coke or umiihi ng 1 litrong tubig. Okay? So, hindi pa naman siguro nangyayari sa atin yun. Pwede siguro yung kalahating litro, 500 ml. Minsan naman, mas konti pa doon. Diba? Minsan nga, pag iihi tayo, naiihing-ihi ka na, pero pag ihi mo, konti lang. Okay? So, usually, yun nga, hindi talaga kaya or hindi talaga nare-reach yung full maximum capacity ng urinary bladder natin for storage. And we usually urinate na bago pa natin ma-reach yung mga capacities na yun. And then, it's actually a response also to prevent having yung mga bacterial infection. Okay? So, syempre, hindi mo naman again, the urine does have components na gusto nga nating i-flush sa katawan. So, why would you let those kumbaga, solutes or mga filtrates to be stored in your urinary bladder for a long time, kung pwede mo naman siyang ilabas na sa katawan. Okay? It's actually parang a defense mechanism din of the urinary bladder that kailangan kapag ka medyo 25% full ka na, kailangan ilabas mo na siya sa katawan. Okay? And then next, you have the urethra. This is actually the tube that exits the bladder, and it carries urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of your body. So here it shows you the ureters and the urinary bladder. So from the kidney, here you see your ureter. So cross-sectionally, it is composed of your transitional epithelium. It has connective tissue, what you call the lamina propria, and then a smooth muscle layer, and then the outer layer is what you call your adventitia. Okay? And then here for your urinary bladder, so outside of it, you have the parietal peritoneum. So this is the body of the urinary bladder. You have the opening of the ureter here. You have the trigone. As you see, bakit siya tinawag na trigone? Kasi yung shape niya ay parang funnel, triangular. And then opening of the urethra. And then of course, the location of the external urethra sphincter. So for the cells or the layers of your urinary bladder wall, you see here that outside you have the connective tissue, in the middle you have a smooth muscle layer, and then you have a connective tissue before you have a transitional epithelium inside. So for the urine movement, it's actually what you call the micturition reflex. So it is activated by the stretch of your urinary bladder wall, and action potentials are conducted from the bladder to the spinal cord through your pelvic nerves. So there's a parasympathetic action potentials that cause the bladder to contract, and stretching of the bladder stimulates sensory neurons to inform the brain of persons needing to urinate. So in here, this is an image showing you the micturition reflex by higher brain centers. So as from seeing this one, in this figure, so the A part or the ascending pathways, so carry an increased frequency of action potentials up the spinal cord to the pons and cerebrum, and when the urinary bladder becomes stretched, this increases the conscious urge to urinate. So on the other hand, you have here your descending pathways which carry action potentials to the sacral region of the spinal cord. And tonically, it inhibits the micturition reflex, so preventing automatic urination when the urinary bladder is full. So the descending pathways carry action potentials from the cerebrum to the sacral region into the spinal cord to facilitate the reflex when stretch of the urinary bladder produces the conscious urge to urinate. And when a person voluntarily chooses to urinate, this reinforces the micturition reflex. So there are instances, it's really true that hindi naman porket pag napupuno na yung ating urinary bladder, wala na tayong control. Okay? So, meron ding part yung brain natin wherein they are the ones also controlling the, kumbaga, the urge of urination. So with the micturition reflex proper, here in number 1, the urine in the urinary bladder stretches the urinary bladder wall, and then action potentials are again sent, okay, because of the stretch. They are sent to the pelvic nerves, to the sacral region of the spinal cord, and then from there, the action potentials are being received by your ascending pathways. So action potentials are carried by the parasympathetic nerves in red to contract the smooth muscles of the urinary bladder, and then decreased action potentials carried by the somatic nerves, or the purple ones, cause the external urinary sphincter to relax. For the body fluid compartment, so first, you should know that there's always an intracellular and extracellular fluid. So the intracellular fluid is a compartment which includes the fluid inside all of the cells of the body, and it's approximately 2/3 of all the water in the body is in the intracellular fluid compartment. And then the extracellular fluid compartment includes all of the fluids outside of the cell, and it's more likely in the interstitial fluid, plasma, lymph, and other special fluids such as joint fluid and cerebrospinal fluid. Composition of the fluids. For intracellular fluid, it contains a relatively high concentration of ions such as your potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate compared to the extracellular fluid. It has a lower concentration of salt or sodium, your calcium, your chloride, and your bicarbonate than those, or than thus your extracellular fluid. So the exchange between the fluid compartments. In here, the cell membranes that separate the body fluid compartments are selectively permeable. So when you say selectively permeable, not all of the ions, or of course, or components in your fluid can be actually can just go in and out from your compartment. So water continually passes through them, but ions dissolved in water do not rapidly or readily pass through the cell membrane. So water movement is regulated mainly by hydrostatic pressure differences and osmotic differences between the compartments. And osmosis controls the movement of water between the intracellular and extracellular spaces. So for the regulation of extracellular fluid composition, first, it can be through thirst regulation. So in here, water intake is controlled by the thirst center located in your hypothalamus. And when the concentration of ions in the blood increases, it stimulates the thirst center to cause your thirst. When water is consumed, the concentrations of blood ions decreases due to a dilution effect. And this causes the sensation of thirst to decrease. The next one is for the ion concentration regulation. So regulating the concentrations of positively charged ions such as sodium, potassium, and calcium in the body fluids is particularly important. Action potentials, muscle contraction, and normal cell membrane permeability depend on the maintenance of a narrow range of these concentrations. And negatively charged ions such as chloride are secondarily regulated by the mechanisms that control the positively charged ions. The negatively charged ions are attracted to the positively charged ions. When the positively charged ions are transported, the negatively charged ions move with them. For the sodium ions are the dominant ions in the extracellular fluid. So there are about 90 to 95% of the osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid results from sodium ions and from the negative ions associated with them. So stimuli that control aldosterone secretion influence the reabsorption of sodium from nephrons of the kidneys and the total amount of sodium in the body fluids. And sodium ions are also excreted in sweat. Kaya nga kapag pinagpapawisan tayo, minsan 'di ba kapag lalo na ang pawis natin ay nagmumula sa ulo at minsan natitikman natin, hindi naman siya matamis, hindi naman siya bitter, hindi naman siya maasim, more likely siya ay maalat because of the sodium that's present on it. Next, you have your potassium ions. So, electrically excitable tissues such as muscles and nerves are highly sensitive to slight changes in the extracellular potassium concentration, which has already been discussed to you from our previous lectures. So, the extracellular concentrations of potassium must be maintained within a narrow range for these tissues to function normally. Aldosterone plays a major role in regulating the concentration of potassium in the extracellular fluid. In here, this actually shows you the homeostasis stimulus and responses when you have blood potassium level differences. Okay, so when homeostasis is disturbed, of course, the blood potassium levels increases. With this one, receptors and control centers act on the adrenal cortex to increase aldosterone secretion. In response of this increase, the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys actually increases the rate of urine. And then homeostasis is restored once the blood potassium levels are decreased. So what if the blood potassium levels are decreased? So decreased blood levels of potassium act on the control center and the adrenal cortex to decrease the aldosterone secretion. In turn, the reduced rate of the potassium secretion from the effectors, the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys into the urine, and then blood potassium levels increase or restored. For the calcium ions, the extracellular concentration of calcium is maintained within a narrow range as well. So increases and decreases in the extracellular concentration of calcium have dramatic effects on the electrical properties of excitable tissues. So with parathyroid hormone, it's secreted by the parathyroid glands. It increases extracellular calcium concentrations. And then calcitonin reduces the blood calcium concentration when it is too high. For the phosphate and sulfate ions, some ions such as phosphate ions and sulfate ions are reabsorbed by active transport in the kidneys. The rate of reabsorption is slow, so that if the concentration of these ions in the filtrate exceeds the nephron's ability to reabsorb them, the excess is excreted into the urine. As long as the concentration of these ions is low, nearly all of them are reabsorbed by active transport. For the regulation of the acid-base balances, so again, you have what you call your buffers. So these are chemicals that resist change in pH of a solute. Buffers in the body contain salts of weak acids or bases that combine with hydrogen. And there are three classes of buffers. First, you have your proteins. Second, your phosphate buffer. And then thirdly is your bicarbonate buffer. So respiratory system is actually involved in acid-base regulation. So it actually responds rapidly to changes in pH. It's actually when there's an increased respiratory rate, it raises the blood pH. So you would actually call it more alkatolic due to the increased rate of carbon dioxide elimination from the body. And reduced respiratory rate reduces pH or more acidic due to the decreased rate of carbon dioxide elimination from the body. So, kidney involvement in acid base. So, the nephrons secrete hydrogen into the urine and directly regulate pH of body fluids. So, more hydrogen secretion if the pH is decreasing, and less hydrogen secretion if pH is increasing. In here, this image shows you the acid-base balance. Of course, when blood pH increases or hydrogen increases in your blood, the stimulus or the receptor and control centers that are affected would be your kidneys, your lungs, and the buffers actually release your hydrogen. And in response, you have your effectors here where fewer hydrogen are removed from the blood and fewer bicarbonate are available to bind with your hydrogen ions. So the number of hydrogen in the blood increases, and with that, homeostasis is restored when blood pH decreases. So this is the vice versa of it. So again, still the receptors and control centers are the lungs and the kidneys which are affected, and of course there are also buffers present. And then of course still the effectors would be the blood. So blood pH will just be restored once a blood pH increases. So, the idea of acidosis and alkalosis. So, acidosis occurs when the pH of the blood falls below 7.35. So, there are two types of acidosis based upon the cause, like respiratory or metabolic acidosis. So, alkalosis naman occurs when the pH of the blood increases above 7.45. So there are two types of alkalosis based upon the cause. It can also be respiratory and metabolic. So for the representative diseases and disorders for your urinary system, first you have what you call your glomerulonephritis. So it is actually the inflammation of the filtration membrane within the renal corpuscle causing the increased membrane permeability. With this, plasma proteins and blood cells enter the filtrate, causing increased urine volume due to the increased osmotic concentration of the filtrate, and can be acute or chronic. So when you say acute, it's actually a short-term disease that you could have, or when you say chronic, it's actually a long-term or progressive type of disease until kidneys become non-functional. So, with glomerulonephritis, it is also connected with what you call your proteinuria. Proteinuria, it is when there's an increased level of protein in your urine. And as you see in the image here, when you have proteinuria, your urine is usually more yellowish in color. So proteins, as we all know, they actually help build muscle and bones. They regulate the amount of fluid in the body and combat infection and repair tissue. So basically, they should actually remain in your blood. So if the protein is, coming out of your body through your urine, of course, it would affect your muscles and bones, and of course, the regulation of the blood and infection in your body. On the other hand, you can also have hematuria. So in hematuria, it produces pink, red, or cola-colored urine due to the presence of the red blood cells in your urine. It can be gross or microscopic. So when you say gross, um, makikita nyo talaga sa quality ng urine nyo na there is the presence of red blood cells because of the color. Kapag sinabi nyo namang microscopic, yung typical color of urine, and makikita nyo lang yung mga red blood cells na yun with the help of your microscope. So that's the difference of the gross and microscopic hematuria. Okay? So guys, kapag nagkakaroon na ng hematuria, it actually gives you the idea, lalo na kapag kaya na cola-colored. So pag sinabi mong cola-colored, medyo paitim na yung kulay ng inyong urine, ibig sabihin malaki na yung sira or damage ng inyong kidneys. So usually, nagkakaroon talaga ng mga ganitong klaseng pamamaga ng kidneys, lalo na sa mga patients or people with diabetes. So, kaya nga, minsan ang mga nagiging, kumbaga, diseases talaga na nare-relate natin sa diabetes is by having, kidney failure. Minsan hindi na talaga yung diabetes yung nagiging cause of death, but it's already the kidneys failing to remove waste from the body. Okay? So next, you have what we call your renal failure. So it can result for any condition that interferes with your kidney function. So what are the causes of your renal failure? So it can also be like what I've said. It can be acute or short term. It occurs when damage of the kidney is rapid and extensive, leading to the accumulation of waste in the body, and it can lead to death in 1 to 2 weeks if renal failure is complete. So what can be the causes of your acute renal failure? You have the pre-renal, intrarenal, and post-renal stages. So in here, the pre-renal is a sudden and severe drop in blood pressure or shock or interruption of blood flow to the kidneys from the severe injury or illness. So next, you have the intrarenal, which is a direct damage to the kidneys by inflammation, toxins, drugs, infection, or reduced blood supply. And then the post-renal is a sudden obstruction of the urine flow due to the enlarged prostate, kidney stones, bladder, tumor, or injury. And then you also have what you call your chronic renal failure, which results from permanent damage to so many nephrons that remain nephrons are inadequate to form or to become normal for the kidney function. So they can be caused by chronic glomerulonephritis, trauma to the kidneys, tumors, or kidney stones. Okay? So guys, whenever that there's a disease already concerning with your kidneys, hindi naman sa nananakot, pero more likely, the journey of that patient can be long-lasting, mahirap at matagal. There would be cases that they would need talaga to have magkakaroon sila ng iba't ibang drugs na kailangang i-take or kailangan nilang palaging magpasala ng dugo. Okay? Just for them to be able to remove the impurities in their blood. And basically, when it comes to kidney transplants, as far as I know, it would actually take around 800,000 pesos for you to have a kidney transplant, with the challenge of finding a compatible kidney for you. So, as early as now, I would like to encourage healthy living, of course, and yun nga, good choice of lifestyle for us to be able to take care of ourselves, especially our kidneys. So, oo, masarap kumain ng maalat, masarap uminom ng mga sodas, pero mas okay pa rin ang water. Okay? Just to flush out all of the impurities in your body. And wag natin nga abusuhin yung katawan natin when it comes to our lifestyle choices. Okay? Kasi mahirap kapag ka ang kidneys natin ang nagkakaroon ng problem at natatamaan. It would actually really cost you a lot of money and of course luck if you will still be alive after having a kidney transplant, because there are some instances that yes, there are patients that do undergo kidney transplants, but at the end the kidneys would actually not work with them. Diba? Anything that is being introduced to the body, kumbaga hindi nakikilala ng body na kanya, there would always be a possibility of rejection. At hindi gagana yung particular body part na yon para sa'yo. Okay? So, that's just a reminder that we have to take care of our kidneys for us to be able to, to enjoy life. And of course, yung mga simple choices natin when it comes to food and lifestyle, it would actually help you a lot. Okay? Usually naman sa mga ganitong mga pagkakataon, no? You also know the urinary tract infection. So, ang pinaka-importante lang naman dyan hygiene. Okay? Na okay yung hygiene, and of course, the intake of water should always be regulated. Okay? So, thank you very much, and that actually ends our lecture for the urinary system. Thank you.